Hey everyone, so we all know the story of the Great Flood, right? God's ultimate reset button for a world that had gone completely off the rails. But what happens when, just a few generations later, humanity starts to become corrupt all over again? God promised he'd never send another flood. So what was his new program? What was the new plan to save a fallen world?
And that right there is the huge central question. The flood was supposed to be a total cleansing. But get this, only 10 generations later, the world was already spiraling back down. God needed a totally new strategy, one that didn't involve wiping the slate clean through destruction. So what was it? This image of a lethal swamp, it just captures the state of the world so perfectly. We are not talking about small mistakes here. We're talking about a full-blown return to things like human sacrifice, idolatry, and violent conquest. I mean, can you imagine? Noah himself lived to see 10 generations of his own descendants become nearly as corrupt as the world that had just been washed away.
And so here is the fundamental shift in the game plan. On the left, you've got the old way, a global reset by just destroying everything. But the new program over on the right was something completely different. It was all about preservation. It was about creating what our source material calls priesthood colonies. Think of them as strategic outposts designed to keep righteousness alive in a world that was sinking back into darkness.
This new program was all about establishing these scattered islands of righteousness. So instead of trying to, drain the entire swamp at once, the new plan was to create and protect these small, thriving communities of faith that could act like lighthouses in the dark, preserving divine knowledge.
So how did these colonies actually work? Well, for starters, they were led by prophets, and they were intentionally scattered across different nations to preserve God's ways everywhere. They even kept their own records, their own revelations and histories. And this was a complete 180 from the usual strategy of gathering all the believers together in one spot. This was about strategic dispersal.
Okay, so to really get how this new program worked in practice, we need a solid example. And honestly, there is no better case study than one of the most important colonies out there, one led by the legendary prophet king of a place called Salem. And this brings us to a man named Melchizedek. He was the leader of the kingdom of Salem, right there in the heart of the land of Canaan. Now, he wasn't just a spiritual guide, he was a king. He held both political power and priesthood authority. Talk about a heavy responsibility. He was tasked with running one of these absolutely critical islands of righteousness. And his spiritual power? It was absolutely immense. The scriptures tell us he was a man of such deep, profound faith that he stopped the mouths of lions and quenched the violence of fire. This isn't just a fancy title, you guys. This is a description of a man who had an extraordinary, direct connection to divine power.
But here's the catch, here's the big challenge. Even though they had this incredible leader, the people of Salem were, as the record puts it, strong in iniquity. They were just full of wickedness. So Melchizedek basically inherited a kingdom that was spiritually rotting from the inside out.
Now, how would a typical ruler from that time have handled this situation? Think of someone like Nimrod, the famous conqueror. His solution would have been simple and brutal. You send in the soldiers, you make an example out of a few people, and you rule through fear. You meet any rebellion with overwhelming force. That was the standard playbook. But Melchizedek, he was no Nimrod. His method for bringing peace was radically different. Instead of force, he relied on spiritual tools. First, he exercised his own incredible faith. Second, he himself lived a life of total righteousness, leading by example. And third, he preached repentance to his people over and over. His power came from God, not from the sword.
And the result of this faith-based approach? He established peace. And not just for a little while, not for a year, but for all his days. He took a wicked, rebellious people and completely transformed them into a peaceful society. And he did it through righteousness, not violence. It was a massive success for God's new program.
And that brings us to the final thought, one pulled straight from the source material. Melchizedek's formula was faith, righteousness, and repentance, and it brought lasting peace to a wicked nation. So the question for us, living in our own divided and troubled world, is this. Could that same formula, one based on personal goodness instead of force, could it actually work today? It's definitely something to think about. Thanks for joining us.